"You lucky bastard." The driver laughed under his breath. "You just killed a Panzer commander by accident." Normandy 1944. The hedgerows burned with the color of smoke and dust. A U.S.S. armed the lot of Aspetes. Sherman tank, call sign Bravo 6, crawled through the mud outside St. Lo. Its armor was dented, its tracks half-caked in clay, and its crew hadn't slept in 2 days. Inside the cramped steel box, sweat and gun oil mixed into the smell of fear. Sergeant Caleb Calstone sat behind the gun sight, squinting through the cracked glass. Ahead of him, a German Panzer IV sat in perfect position, camouflaged beneath the ruins of a farmhouse. The Panzer's gun twitched like a viper, ready to strike. "Range?" Stone barked. 800 meters, his commander, Lieutenant Marcus, answered. Stone steadied his hand, heart hammering like a piston. He'd fired dozens of shells before, but this one felt different. Too quiet, too still. He squeezed the trigger. The 75mm shell screamed out, hit the side of a wall, and missed. "God damn it, Cal," the loader shouted. "You missed him clean," Stone cursed, chambering another round. But before he could fire again, the missed shell detonated somewhere behind the farmhouse. A half-second later, a shockwave rolled through the valley. The farmhouse exploded, flames erupted, and black smoke twisted upward like a ghost. Through the periscope, Stone saw Chaos Men running, a commander's half-track engulfed in fire. The Panzer turret froze mid-turn, abandoned. The crew went silent. "What the hell did you hit?" Marcus whispered. Stone swallowed. "I don't know, but it worked." The radio crackled. Reports coming in that the German line was falling back. One missed shot. One ricochet had detonated a munitions pile near the German command post. What was supposed to be failure had crippled an entire defensive flank. Outside, the sound of retreating German engines faded into the wind. Inside, the crew sat in stunned silence. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Driver Taggart laughed under his breath. "You lucky bastard," he said. "You just killed a Panzer commander by accident." Stone didn't laugh. His hands trembled around the steel handles of the gun. He hadn't aimed for luck. He'd just done what instinct told him. That night when he wrote in his pocket journal, the words came slow. "We call it a miss, but maybe luck just favors those too mad to stop shooting." The next morning, as they rolled forward past the smoking ruins, the rumor had already spread. The men of the 2nd Armored Division had a new legend, the gunner who missed and won. For years after the war, documentaries and history books repeated the same story, that American gunners won because they were better trained, more accurate, and had superior fire control. But the men who fought inside those tanks knew better. Accuracy was a luxury. Survival was improvisation. Sergeant Caleb Stone often joked that the first casualty of battle was aim. Inside, a Sherman visibility was limited to slits and periscopes. Smoke filled the cabin after every shot, and recoil shook the crew so hard it blurred the world. The dream of precision ended the moment the first shell screamed back in your direction. The Germans had precision. Panthers and Tigers had advanced optics, longer barrels, and rangefinders accurate to the meter. They could destroy a Sherman from 1,500 yards away. The Americans had speed, numbers, and something harder to measure, nerve. In training manuals, tank gunnery was all geometry, angles, wind, trajectory. But in the mud of Normandy, geometry died in the smoke. Tankers learned to fight by sound, by feel, by instinct. They fired at muzzle flashes, not coordinates. They learned to read the rhythm of the battlefield, one heartbeat between firing and death. Stone had never scored high in gunnery drills. He was quick, reckless, and relied on gut reaction more than training. Officers called him undisciplined. His crew called him alive. "The Germans fought with perfection," he once said. "We fought with panic that learned how to aim." That was the truth the movies never showed. There was no calm voice calling targets, no perfect hit every time. Most shells missed. Most kills happened by surprise, by chance, or by stubborn men refusing to give up. Historians would later call it the mathematics of chaos. The reality that in real combat, the more you fired, the greater your odds of survival. The Sherman wasn't built to outgun. It was built to outlast. The myth of precision came later, written by men who'd never seen what happened inside a burning tank. They wanted clean numbers, but war is never clean. Cal Stone and his crew lived minute to minute, knowing that every pull of the trigger could mean the end or another miracle. He didn't aim for glory. He aimed to make it home. And on that battlefield near Saint-Lô, when his missed shot won the day, the world finally saw the truth. Sometimes chaos hits harder than skill. To understand what Caleb Stone did, you have to understand the world he lived in, the metal coffin of a Sherman tank. It was a furnace, a thunderclap, and a home all at once. The armor was only 2 inches thick. The noise inside was enough to rattle your teeth loose. When the gun fired, dust fell from every bolt. When an enemy shell hit, it sounded like God slamming a hammer against the world. 5 men lived inside that space. The driver, Taggart, with hands blistered from the clutch. The bow gunner, Hicks, who prayed louder than he shot. The loader, Knox, whose arms were always black with powder burns. The commander, Lieutenant Marcus, a 4-year-old from Kansas, who had never seen war before June 6, 1944. And the gunner, Stone, whose right eye was always red from squinting into the scope. They moved together like one creature. When one coughed, all heard it. When one panicked, all felt it. The smell of sweat, fuel, and cordite was the perfume of their days. Outside, the world was a chaos of hedgerows and snipers. Inside, it was ritual. Load, aim, fire, pray. The Sherman was a marvel of production, not protection. The Germans mocked it as a Tommy cooker, a tank that caught fire too easily. They weren't wrong. The thin armor made it vulnerable, but its design made it replaceable. For every German tank built, the United States built 5. And for every Sherman destroyed, another rolled off the factory line within a week. Stone didn't think of it as strategy. He just knew there were always more tanks behind him. We were like an assembly line that bled, he once said. We weren't better soldiers. We were part of a machine that didn't stop. Behind those tanks was a nation that had transformed itself into an industrial juggernaut. Detroit built engines instead of cars. Ford built bombers. Women riveted armor plates and painted numbers on shells. Every shot Stone fired was powered by a million hands he'd never meet. The Germans had better optics. The Americans had better logistics. And sometimes that was enough. When the crews weren't fighting, they were fixing. Every battle left dents, holes, snapped cables. Mechanics scavenged parts from destroyed tanks. Some crews painted over the burn marks. Others kept them as scars. Inside the turret, Cal scratched words into the steel near his seat. Miss Small, live long. It became his superstition. If he fired tight, maybe luck would bounce back his way. That was the world of a tanker. No comfort, no certainty, just 5 men trapped inside. Noise, smoke, and faith. Every morning when the hatches opened and sunlight cut through the dark, they all wondered quietly if they'd see another one. The Sherman was never meant to be elegant. It was meant to be enough. And somehow for men like Cal Stone, enough was all it took to make legends out of survivors. The day before the shot that would make him famous, Cal Stone tried something his commander had forbidden. The Sherman had taken damage from a near miss, and the gun's elevation gear was jammed. It could still fire, but the barrel drifted slightly upward after every shot. Technically, it should have been sent back for repair. Instead, Cal decided to work around it. He told his crew, "If the gun won't hold still, I'll make it part of the aim." They thought he was joking. He wasn't. He tested the recoil at different distances, firing practice shells into an empty field. He noticed that if he fired slightly below the target line, the gun's upward drift caused the shell to arc higher than expected, striking low targets from strange angles. The ricochet was unpredictable but deadly when it worked. Lieutenant Marcus called it insanity. Cal called it mathematics. "You don't fix broken things in war," he said. "You learn how to break them better." When he fired that infamous miss near Saint-Lô, he was using that very technique. He aimed low, expecting the shell to bounce into the target's side. Instead, it struck the wall behind the farmhouse, ricocheted through debris, and hit the munitions pile that destroyed the Panzer command post. The explosion that followed wasn't luck. It was the universe rewarding madness. After the battle, the tank crews began talking. They called it the mad trick, the ricochet shot that hit everything but what it aimed for. Mechanics and engineers later examined the report and dismissed it as chance. But for those who were there, it was proof that instinct could sometimes outsmart engineering. That night, as the men ate cold rations beside the tank, Cal finally laughed. "Guess the army can court-martial me for bad aim," he said. Marcus replied quietly, "Not when it saves an entire line." What made Cal's method remarkable wasn't the physics. It was the defiance. American warfare thrived on order, procedure, and repetition. But history often hinged on men who didn't follow orders, who trusted their nerve more than manuals. In that burned-out village, one mistake turned into a miracle of momentum. And from that day forward, every crew in Bravo Company had a running joke. When your shot goes wide, maybe it's just finding something better to hit. And it would take months before anyone officially recognized what had happened. Reports filtered back to command, embellished and reinterpreted, but one phrase kept repeating in every account: the ricochet that saved the flank. Cal Stone never claimed genius. He just shrugged and said, "The tank did what it wanted. I just held on." In war, that was often enough. In the weeks after St. Lo, stories of the ricochet spread like wildfire. Tankers whispered about it at supply depots and in mess tents, a tale of a mad gunner whose wild shot turned into a legend. Some said it was luck. Others called it divine intervention. But among the crews there was an unspoken truth. No manual could have prepared them for survival. Caleb Stone hated the attention. "If I'd missed a little lower," he told his loader, "we'd be smoke and parts. Don't make a hero out of a mistake." But deep down he knew why it mattered. In a war of numbers, small miracles gave men something to believe in. The Army's Ordnance Division later analyzed his after-action report. The engineers wrote a memo calling his ricochet physically plausible under abnormal ballistic conditions. It was the closest the bureaucracy ever came to saying you got lucky. But it wasn't just luck. Cal had learned to feel the recoil pattern, to predict how the tank shifted on uneven ground, to sense where chaos might align. It was a pilot's instinct in a gunner's hands. And that's where the true collapse math of war came in. Every equation of strategy, production, logistics, training, broke down in the fog of battle. What saved men wasn't precision or planning, but adaptability. The kind that came from people, not policy. While generals calculated fuel and ammunition, men like Cal did their own math. The distance to the next shot, the number of shells left, the seconds until the next enemy round hit. Every move was a gamble, every breath a borrowed one. Cal once told a war correspondent, "They build tanks by the thousands, but it's the one behind the trigger that makes them dangerous." It became his unofficial epitaph. By late summer, the tide in Normandy had shifted. Shermans advanced through shattered towns, supported by artillery and air cover. But for the men inside, the fear never changed. The Germans still had Tigers, and every encounter was a coin toss between life and vapor. That's why Cal's mad trick meant more than a lucky shot. It was proof that improvisation could rival technology. It was a reminder that human instinct could still rewrite physics, even in a world ruled by machines. Years later, when historians interviewed surviving tank crews, they often returned to the story. "You can't plan for chaos," one said. "You can only learn to live inside it." Caleb Stone had lived inside it, and for one impossible afternoon, chaos had listened to him. He never taught the method formally. He said the trick only worked when the shooters stopped trying to be perfect. "You want precision?" he said once. "Go build a bridge. In war, you just make something happen." That's what he'd done. He made something happen in defiance of physics, protocol, and probability. And somehow that defiance became part of the quiet arithmetic of victory. The village of St. Lo had already been bombed into dust. Its church stood like a broken spine against the sky. Smoke curled through the streets, and the sound of artillery echoed off every wall. Cal Stone and his crew rolled their Sherman through the ruins, nerves stretched to a breaking point. Their orders were simple: hold the line until infantry arrived. But the radio crackled with chaos, the flank collapsing, reinforcements delayed, and German armor closing in. They found a defensive position behind a collapsed farmhouse, using the rubble as cover. Across the open field, dark shapes appeared. Panzer IVs moving with slow, deliberate menace. The air was thick with diesel and fear. "3 of them, maybe 4, said Lieutenant Marcus, scanning through his periscope. "They've got range. We don't." Cal adjusted his sight. The elevation gear still jammed slightly, the same quirk he had turned into a weapon weeks earlier. He thought about reporting it again, but there was no time. Loader, high explosive. Let's wake them up. The shell fired, shaking the tank like an earthquake. It hit short, ploughing dirt in front of the lead Panzer. The German turret swung toward the flash. Fast, efficient, lethal. Back up, Marcus shouted. The driver gunned the engine, treads grinding on broken stone. Another shell screamed overhead, exploding behind them. The shockwave slammed against the Sherman's hull. Cal steadied his aim. They'll hit us next shot, he muttered. Unless we hit something first. He aimed low, just below the Panzer's front armor, the same mad angle he discovered before. The shell left the barrel with a deafening roar, struck a piece of debris, and ricocheted upward like a billiard shot. A second later, fire erupted from the German tank's turret. Inside the Sherman, no one spoke. The crew just stared through the periscope as black smoke billowed skyward. Did you mean to do that? The loader whispered. Cal smirked. Define mean. Another Panzer fired. The round missed, but the concussion tore bricks from the farmhouse. Cal reloaded and fired again. Another angled shot that skipped off the ground and struck near the second tank's track. Sparks, then smoke, then stillness. The rest of the German armor turned away, retreating toward the tree line. When the radio finally crackled to life, a nearby platoon asked, "Who the hell's holding Saint-Lô?" Marcus replied, voice calm but shaky. "Just one mad gunner and a half-dead tank." That night, the surviving crews joked that Stone had turned his Sherman into a ricochet cannon. They drew chalk marks on his turret, 3 little stars, one for each tank that didn't make it back. But when the laughter faded, silence filled the air. They all knew how thin the line between miracle and massacre really was. As Cal sat on the hull cleaning his scope, he looked at the burned-out field. "If I ever tell this story," he said quietly, "nobody's going to believe it." He was wrong. They all did, and that impossible shot became part of Saint-Lô's legend. The day one crew, outnumbered and outgunned, turned broken machinery and blind faith into victory. In the weeks after Saint-Lô, reports trickled up the chain of command. Somewhere between the chaos and the paperwork, Caleb Stone's name started appearing in dispatches. The ricochet shot, the 3 destroyed Panzers, the impossible defense. It was all there. But so were 100 other stories from a war drowning in heroism. The battalion commander called him in for debriefing. Cal stood in front of the desk, hat in hand, uniform still stained with oil. The colonel flipped through the report. "Your fire pattern doesn't make sense, Sergeant." "You're telling me this shot bounced?" Cal nodded. "Yes, sir. Off the ground, through debris, into the ammo storage." The colonel stared at him for a long time, then leaned back. "And you're claiming that was intentional?" Cal hesitated. "I'm claiming it worked, sir." The colonel smiled thinly. "Sometimes, Sergeant, luck is the best tactic." He signed the paperwork and handed it to a clerk. "No medal." "Not this time." Outside the tent, the air smelled of cordite and dust. Cal lit a cigarette, took one drag, and said to himself, "Guess I'll have to settle for being alive." But his men didn't settle. They painted the mad trick on the side of the Sherman in white chalk and swore to keep the story alive. When a visiting journalist from Stars and Stripes asked what it meant, Marcus answered simply, "It's what happens when you stop aiming for perfection and start aiming to survive." The article ran a week later, buried on page 4, but that was enough. Tank crews from across the front began sending letters to Stone's unit, asking if the ricochet method was real. Some tried it themselves. A few even claimed success. Most just wanted to believe it was possible. By autumn, the war had moved on, and Cal's story faded into rumor. But among the men who fought beside him, it became something sacred, a reminder that courage didn't always look like medals or ceremony. Sometimes it looked like a man who refused to give up when the rulebook stopped making sense. Years later, a historian named Colonel Alan Vance interviewed Cal for a book on tank warfare. Cal was gray-haired then, slower to speak, his hands still scarred from the war. Vance asked, "Did you ever wish they'd given you that medal?" Cal chuckled. "A medal's metal. That field was full of ghosts. I got to walk away. That's enough shine for me." Vance pressed him again. "Do you think it was luck or skill?" Cal smiled faintly. "Both. But maybe luck shows up for the ones who don't stop trying." The quote made it into the book's final chapter under a simple heading, the math of survival. And though history never gave Caleb Stone a medal, the men who served under him carried his story for the rest of their lives. Proof that sometimes in the middle of madness, a single act of defiance could echo louder than any award. It wasn't about glory, it was about grit. And that was enough to make one man's mad trick immortal. By early 1945, Cal Stone's mad trick had stopped being a story told over cigarettes. It had quietly become part of an unofficial training lesson passed between tank crews. They called it ricochet fire, though no manual mentioned it, no officer endorsed it, and no official film ever showed it. But among the men who fought at Saint-Lô-Mortagne and the Siegfried Line, the phrase aim low carried a different kind of power. When new recruits joined the unit, veterans told them, "You won't always get a clean shot, but if you've got guts, you'll make one." They didn't teach equations or ballistics. They taught instinct, timing, and courage. The things that couldn't be measured, but often decided who lived through the day. Cal didn't see himself as a teacher. He still fixed gearboxes, cleaned barrels, and cursed the mud like everyone else. But he noticed how the men watched him not like a legend, but like a reference point. When the radio went dead or when orders didn't make sense, they looked to him for the next move. That was the quiet burden of survival. Heroes didn't feel like heroes. They just had one more night to endure while others didn't. In late March, near the Rhine, Cal's tank unit faced another German counterattack. The Panzers were fewer now, but still deadly. This time, Cal didn't fire a ricochet. He didn't need to. His new gunner, barely 20, lined up a perfect shot, breathing steady as Cal whispered, "Now." The shell hit true. The Panzer erupted in flame. Afterward, the kid turned to him and said, "That was for Saint-Lô, right?" Cal just smiled. That was for the guys who didn't make it. He realized then that the trick had outgrown him. It wasn't just a shot. It was a mindset, a belief that even in the worst odds, a man could still fight smart, not desperate. When the war ended, the records showed the 3rd Armored Division destroyed hundreds of German tanks. Most of those victories were by the book. But somewhere inside the chaos, the unapproved, unorthodox, mad methods of men like Caleb Stone had saved thousands of lives. After the war, Cal returned home to Illinois. He fixed tractors, raised 2 sons, and rarely spoke about combat. But one afternoon, when a neighbor asked how he survived, he said quietly, "You learn where to aim when life stops giving you targets." The neighbor didn't understand at first. Years later, that same line appeared in a veterans column under the heading, "Wisdom from the Gunners." Historians never wrote about Cal's ricochet in their grand overviews of the war, but in garages, reunions, and barroom conversations, his legend lingered because it captured something most reports never could. That survival wasn't just about weapons or willpower, it was about adaptability. The courage to try the impossible when nothing else would work. That was the math of Caleb Stone, a man who never asked for fame, but whose one impossible shot rippled across generations of soldiers who believed that sometimes luck favors the ones who never stop fighting. By 1946, long after the guns had gone silent and Europe began to rebuild, Cal Stone's story made its way into whispers within the armored corps. Officers who once dismissed his shot as reckless began using it as an example of battlefield ingenuity. Quietly, the bird, Bienthelm, Army commissioned an internal review on unorthodox gunnery success under pressure. Buried in the report was one unnamed case study, a ricochet shot in Normandy that destroyed 3 Panzers. Cal never saw that report. He was too busy rebuilding his life back home. His hands still trembled when he fixed engines, and sometimes he would wake in the night, reaching for a non-existent periscope. His wife once found him sitting on the porch before dawn, staring at the fields as if waiting for something to emerge from the fog. When she asked what he was thinking about, he said softly, "The shot I almost didn't take." For years, veterans sought him out at reunions. They wanted to shake the hand of the man who'd made the mad shot. Some told him they'd tried it too, that it had saved their tanks, their crews, their lives. Cal always smiled and said, then it wasn't so mad after all. He never called it genius. He called it desperation. At a veterans gathering in 1959, a young lieutenant asked him to give a short talk on leadership. Cal stood before the small crowd, cleared his throat, and began. You'll be told to follow orders, to trust training, to respect the book. That's all good advice. But there's one thing the book doesn't tell you. Sometimes the book's wrong. Sometimes it takes a fool to do what's needed. The room was silent for a long time afterward. When someone asked if he regretted taking the shot, he replied, "No, I'd regret not trying." In the decades that followed, tank warfare changed. New armor, new weapons, new strategies. But the essence of what Cal embodied, initiative under fire, became doctrine. The UN's Army began teaching flexibility and innovation as a core principle. Commanders were reminded that on a chaotic battlefield, one soldier's split-second choice could turn the tide. Cal never claimed to invent anything, but he had lived it. The terrifying, impossible clarity of that moment, when he had nothing left but instinct. When he died in 1968, a few surviving crewmates gathered to honor him. They didn't wear medals. They brought an old shell casing from a Sherman tank and set it beside his grave. Someone scratched into the brass, "The mad trick, Saint-Lô." It wasn't official recognition. It was something better. Proof that memory can be more permanent than metal. His legacy didn't belong in history books. It belonged to the men who learned from him, who knew that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the refusal to stop thinking when fear takes hold. And so the verdict of history was this: Caleb Stone wasn't mad. He was the future, disguised as a fool. Caleb Stone's story ends not with a medal or a monument, but with an empty shell casing on a quiet grave and a lesson etched in steel. Courage doesn't always look like bravery. Sometimes it looks like defiance. His mad trick wasn't about luck or genius. It was about a man who refused to surrender to hopelessness, who turned chaos into calculation and made survival an act of creativity. In the grand history of World War II, his name never appeared beside the famous generals or decorated aces. But among the men who fought on the ground, his legend lived on. They whispered about him in mess halls, on firing ranges, and in the long silence between battles. There was this gunner, they'd say, who aimed at the dirt and hit destiny instead. Stone's story reminds us that war isn't just fought with strength. It's won with imagination, instinct, and the will to keep fighting when reason says you're finished. He didn't change the war, but in that one impossible shot, he showed what kind of men did. And maybe that's what heroism really is, not following the rules, but rewriting them when everything's on the line.